My name is Iver Nore. I was born in Wrangell in 1955, 69 years. We bought this property from my uncle in 1990. My grandpa, Iver Pederson Nore, moved to Wrangell in like 1908 or 1906 or something like that, and he came up and went seining. They said that there was a lot of fish up there and the person could make a lot of money. He came over from Norway and they stopped in Portland, Oregon, and the family stayed there, and he came to Wrangell and went fishing for the summer. Well, it changed a lot of different things. It was a dairy at first. Before that, they had a sand and gravel business, and they owned where Shoemaker Bay is right now, and they did sand and gravel. And then the state of Alaska wanted to make a boarding school out at 5 Mile, so they sold the property to the city of Wrangell so that they would build a boarding school out there so they could move the road 5 more miles out the road, and they would have electricity that far out the road for other people. So in 1933, they bought 8 cows from Petersburg and brought them over here. And this is, they got a 4-acre parcel from the state of Alaska, and this is right, the 4 acres is right here. And my dad, Bert Nore, got 4 acres. And his brother Ingar got 4 acres, so there was 12 acres right through here, and that's where they started the dairy right here. Well, my grandpa, Iver Pederson, and he had 4 sons, and they all worked on in the dairy part and the sand and gravel. Well, back in the day, all the milk, you know, they sold milk to the whole town. They delivered it. They had 150 acres of land up the river, and they took the cows up there and milked them, and then in the summertime and brought the milk back to town. And then Ingwall was in town, and they did the bottling and the cooling it off. They had freezer units, and they cooled the milk off, and then they did deliveries every day to whoever wanted to buy milk. They had hogs and chickens. They had hogs, and that's how they cleared all the land. It was big, you know, when they got it, it was all trees, and they fenced it all in. And if you know hogs, they root, they get underneath, they kill things, they eat the bark and the trees and stuff like that, and so they just rooted out all the trees in here. And then when the trees died, they cut the trees down, and then they dynamited the stumps out, and so it was all clear all along through here, like for 8 acres. And you know, it grew back so that in the wintertime the cows would roam around, and there wasn't much to eat in the wintertime though, because wintertime they had to have hay. And what they did was 2 of the boys had gill netters, and they would gill net on the Stickeen River, and you know, for cohos and king salmon, and they'd sell that, and a lot of that money went to pay back. They had to buy straw and hay for the cows to eat all winter, and they'd store it upstairs in the barn. And in I think it was 1947 or something like that, it was like a couple years after the war, World War II, they had a longshore strike in Seattle, and nothing came to Wrangell, and so they didn't have, you know, they grazed the cows all winter or summer up on the flats up the river, and then when they came back to town, they didn't have any food for them. They had, you know, enough for a little while, and so they had to start killing off the cows. And they kept a couple of them, but by that time they already had other businesses that they were gonna, you know, get into. I don't think they ever did. They came from here, and it wasn't a road down there. It was just like a path or a trail what people walked back and forth, or had their horses or whatever they did back then, and our little mud trail. And they just walked the beach all the way to town with the cows. And they had their house was in town on 728 Case Avenue, where Dan and Twyla, my dad lived there, and Dan and Twyla lived there, and then now Twyla lives there. And they had a big barge on the beach there. They had all kinds of buildings and barns in town also. And they just walk the cows. They get on the barge, and then they'd run the barge up to the flats, and the cows would get out, and they'd stay up probably from when it was probably May to September. I'm not sure. I think they were Jerseys. And I think it was the strongest breed for this type of environment. Because, cows, everything around here is wet, and so cows' hooves were always nasty. If you look at deer and moose and stuff like that, they're made for this type of weather, but cows and things weren't. And so they had a lot of problems with hoof rot and things like that. A lot of this stuff was still around when I was a kid. We lived in a house down by the highway until I was 4 years old, and then we moved to town, but all the buildings and the docks and the barges and stuff were they were still around, and so into the mid-60s. And that's when everything started falling apart, and there was a great big building over here, and when they stopped with the farm, with the dairy part of it, then they built the boat, the Iver Pederson Nore. My uncle did, with help from other old Norwegian shipwrights, and they built it in Wrangell. And then he went out and he bottom trawled for scrap fish. He had mink, and he built 2 big mink pens out here, and so they would skin mink in the fall time and sell the mink hides. And so that's what I remember most, was the mink and the whole thing of with bottom fish, flounders and stuff like that. They grind it up, and he had a big building right where our house is now, and it had big freezer units in it, and we grind all the mink, the food up for the mink, and then he would feed them all summer long in winter with that, and he would lease the Iver P out, and they would fish it all summer long. And then I think they shut the mink farm down in like 74 or 75. It wasn't politically correct to kill mink for their skins. People didn't like it anymore, so they didn't make much money. So that was turned down, and then they moved south, and that's when we bought the place from them in 1990. But it was like abandoned for a lot of years. He came up in the summertime, but he didn't live in the wintertime anymore. So the house and everything kind of got disrepair, kind of fallen down.